you'll see from the first slide, she's the Spanish Chair of Multicultural Integration at the Lucas Graduate School of Business, San Jose State University, and currently is a visiting professor of strategy and management at INSEAD's European campus at Fontainebleau in France. We've been treated over lunch before this to a bit of a foretaste of what Mary Yoko is going to talk about, and as you'll see from the title, her interest is in using the hidden strengths of individuals with multicultural identities, and Mary Yoko herself is a remarkable instance of a multicultural identity as a strategic advantage in today's global organization. So I think that pretty much speaks for itself, and I think I can guarantee you a really interesting talk this lunchtime. So thank you all for coming, and Mary Yoko, thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you. I would apologize for having such a long title, but actually I don't know how to make short titles. I think if you're interdisciplinary, you have long titles at the top, so I have a long title. So really, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. What I thought I'd do today is talk about my most recent research. And so I'm really happy to talk about research that I started about 5 years ago in leading interdisciplinary global team of researchers, thought leaders, on understanding biculturalism and multicultural identity. And the idea behind it is that this is the new demographic in the workforce. Multinational corporations is where people come together culturally, more and more as the focal point for kind of a cultural meeting ground. And as more and more countries have a demographic that is predominantly multicultural of the workforce coming in, then what do we know about these people? And what do we know about what they bring to organizations? And shouldn't we pay attention to this? And it's a conundrum because the companies themselves don't even see this as a statistic. They see that we have so many Asians, so many Asian North Americans, or so many Pacific Islanders, or whatever it is, but they don't think about, well, what is it that these people bring? Or what is the difference between these people, or within this demographic? And then the individuals themselves have no idea. So generally, multiculturals or biculturals have a chip on their shoulder. They've grown up feeling like they're not really Vietnamese, or they're not really Korean. You know, they maybe don't even speak Korean. You know, so and then the companies that hire them think of them as Koreans / or hyphenated something, when they feel really insecure about their Koreanness. You know. And so in part, at this point in my career, I suppose I can do some research, search and understanding myself as well. But actually, I think all research ought to be grounded in something you're passionate about. And so I'm very passionate about this. And so we've basically, over the course of 5 years, we've had 2 thought leadership conferences, one that took place in the Gulf region, and thus this slide. We had our second thought leadership conference in Abu Dhabi, where we took it up a notch from defining what is biculturalism and understanding more the individual level of what is a bicultural or a person with multicultural identity, to then thinking about, well, what are the implications of multiculturals in terms of policy implementation, both in organizations at the strategic level, but also at the country-state level. So here in Canada, you have a policy toward multiculturalism, and I was talking to some of you that I see this in Canada as somewhat of the stew model. I like food, and so I like food metaphors. So in Canada, you have chunks of different nationalities and whatnot. In the US, you know, we've had the puree model, the melting pot model. And you know, so in California, where I just was, the maid at my hotel was surprised I spoke Spanish. Why? Because many Hispanics don't speak Spanish anymore in California because of the puree model, right? And so there are different models for multicultural integration. And so at the second Thought Leadership Conference, we had people from UNESCO, we had people who were from ministries of governments, like we had the Danish minister in charge of integration, in Denmark, which has been having quite big challenges for integration there, as well as HR directors and whatnot, to talk about, what are some best practices in terms of integrating. And one of the things that was quite interesting in the Gulf region is some Iranian participants were saying the #1 popular show in Iran is TV dramas. I know that being in Victoria, that Korean soap operas are really popular, but did you know that Iranians are watching these too? Very interesting, that pop culture is pervasive, even in the Gulf region. And the Gulf region, I have to say, in terms of those students that might be here, or those who are directing students, is quite an interesting natural experiment, because you've got 70% of the people working in the Gulf region are expatriates from various different countries, and roughly 30% are Muslim from the area, right? And so they're working together in global projects. And so if you're interested in understanding, what it is that these people bring, what it is that they can accomplish, this is a very interesting place to study. So the research is motivated by thinking beyond the current state. And so beyond thinking about aggregate cultural differences, understanding that culture is a very complicated and complex phenomenon. And so this is work that I started in my dissertation. I don't want to talk about previous work that much, but basically I've always been uncomfortable from the beginning of my career before my PhD, where I was a cross-cultural consultant. I earned money enough to send myself through college by being a cross-cultural consultant, but I never was comfortable about saying, the Japanese are like this and the Americans are like this, and so you have to do X, Y, Z, because then people would come back and said, oh, well, I handed my business card to them just like this, and I said their last name with a sign, and then the guy just said, oh, just call me Mac. What's up with that? You just told me what the cultural general model is, and it's not working, And so I think we're in a world where these kind of aggregate level understandings of culture is not really giving us the kind of information we need to be working in the global meeting ground of a multinational. It doesn't help us understand what to do. The Iranians might have grown up on Korean soap operas. What does that mean if I'm Korean working with them? What perspective are they going to take on me? Then there's complexities of context, and so I've been looking at entertainment. I've done a lot on Disney, for example, in their internationalization. I've worked in ball bearings. I've worked in paper earlier on. So how does culture enter into the equation in regards to different industries? And clearly, if you're in entertainment, this is a soft industry where national culture and organizational culture are both very, very relevant spheres of culture. But how about in ball bearings, some kind of a hard technology? Will culture matter here? Will the context matter? In many of the contexts, and a context I'm working with right now, which is the oil and gas industry, you have different stakeholders representing different industrial contexts coming together in work teams with very different understanding of what they bring and what they're mediating in terms of cultural context. And I'll just talk a little bit about technologies. Been dealing with flash memory. The Spansion chair is from a merger between AMD in the Silicon Valley and Fujitsu on flash memory. It's now a fully integrated organization, global organization. And so just a little bit more on stakeholders and their different, the complexity of what the global meeting ground is like. I'm working with Schlumberger right now, which is one of the largest gas and oil companies, and very, very global organization, have been globalized. They're kind of like the gold standard, actually, in oil and gas, in terms of how they go about developing Schlumberger employees to be global-minded. But they have a very, very challenging mandate, and that is that their number one employee that they seek in terms of the technical understandings that they have is a Houston Texan geologist. That's who they hire the most. And their number one problem in terms of retention and success in global teams on oil rigs is around Houston, Texan geologists. They have a they're very incompetent really in managing global teams, but they'll be the ones that know the technology the best to be able to sense the different types of soil and rock formations that you might be hitting with your high-tech digging operation and whatnot. And so what I'm working with Schlumberger on is understanding, what are the competencies that this Texan geologist needs to have to be able to be effective in working with people, a global team that might be from England, Nairobi, for example, when they're out in the Saharan desert or right outside of Moscow, for example, digging for oil. And when these individuals are having to deal with stakeholders around them who may have very little global understanding about the world, that may be very local-minded and not have any kind of understanding in terms of what the concerns of the parent company might be. Right? So what kind of skill sets are needed? So these kind of conditions into complexities of cultures and contexts and technologies lead to new objectives for global talent management. And these include a shift from the transfer of single multinational company know-how from the home context to the periphery, to being able to really sense what there is in the periphery that is useful knowledge that could be melded back into the home organization and then leveraged in new contexts. More and more, this is a skill set that needs to be done so that the vector has to go from home to periphery home and then re-leveraging. There's a change of mindset from co-specialization to co-learning. Includes and so what needs to be done is having integrating structures like a knowledge management architecture for a firm that would be able to help the firm compete and reinvent itself in terms of its core technologies, and sustaining a workforce that is at once global and local. Oftentimes, small subcontractors may have very little global or multicultural knowledge, and so it really requires a variety of different skill sets that we haven't been training for or selecting for in global organizations. So it's a new demand for individuals. They need to partner and collaborate in teams where multiple stakeholders from varied cultural contexts with different technological knowledge are represented, and to be able to manage and perform in real time under these complexities. I like complexity, and I guess if you're born into complexity, you find it wherever you go, but we're in a world of these complexities. So effective global leadership now requires understanding, recognizing, training, and leveraging new cognitive and behavioral skills. And the skill sets include deep cultural sensitivity and awareness, bridging and boundary spanning, knowledge sharing capabilities, especially tacit knowledge, because tacit knowledge is the most valuable knowledge because it's tacit. It's also the most difficult knowledge to be able to sense, because even the people themselves who have the knowledge don't know they have it. So it requires a very different organizational structure to be able to sense this kind of knowledge and then leverage it. So culturally nuanced and agile leadership is necessary. And a little bit on the complex cultural makeup. Bicultural individuals like Nissan, Carlos Ghosn are becoming more and more the new demographic. In the automobile industry, there's Jack Nasser, who's a Lebanese Australian, who was the only CEO of Ford Motor Company who wasn't from the Ford family, for example, but who led Ford into Ford 2000, which was the most aggressive growth period for Ford when it acquired Jaguar, Volvo, Mazda, and did a lot around integration globally at that time. Nissan's Carlos Goshen is very interesting because this is a Lebanese Brazilian French person. Okay, and he headed up the Nissan-Renault Alliance. And I don't know if you all know this story, but he was able to go into Nissan and give them a radical mandate for their financial goals in 8 months' time, and be able to be respected by Nissan, and be able to get the commitment of the Nissan workers to be able to save Nissan, which was in such incredible financial stress, and to pull their growth, Renault-Nissan growth, into the highest growth of any automobile company during this most challenging financial times. And the question is, how did he know this? Because, you know, Carlos Goshen, there's no part of him that's Japanese, right? And so how did he know what to do in Japan? Right? So after 8 months of going to all of this, so he decided before making a mandate to Nissan, he would spend 8 months going to every single dealership of Nissan, every single plant of Nissan, spending time talking to people online. Tell me about what you're doing and why you're doing it that way, speaking to the accountants, seeing the books and whatnot. And then after 8 months, he gave them a protocol of what they needed to do and what financial goals they needed to make within the next year. And then he said to them, if you don't make it, I'm going to step down. Basically, he said, if you don't make it, I'm going to do harakiri. How did this French, Lebanese, Brazilian guy know he's supposed to say, I'm going to do harakiri if we don't make our financial goals? Well, we think he did it because he's bicultural, and bicultural means that it's not just culture-specific knowledge that he had, but somehow he was able to intuit in this situation. This is a hierarchical situation. This is where age seniority matters. This is where longevity matters. This is where customer relationship matters. This is a place where I cannot give them some goals without them knowing that I respect them. And the only way I can show that I respect them is that I go and see what they're doing. And after which time, if I give them a stringent goal, they'll believe me that I actually have looked and I know that they can do this. And then if I say I'll step down, then they'll be behind me. You know, so that he's been able to intuit this. So nationality as cultural indicator is becoming less and less useful. So when you join an organization and they say, Ana Maria, oh, she's Hispanic, she's going to be warm and fuzzy and hug us, and we'll put her in kind of a extroverted role in our company or whatnot, and it turns out she's an introvert and she doesn't even speak Spanish or whatnot. I know you do, but it could be the case. So such hybrids, they possess inherent skills that we need to know about, that are more and more valuable given the context that we're looking at now. And so just on the demographics, in the second Thought Leadership conference, on our morning of our second day, I had designed, a couple hours where each person would talk a little bit about their national cultural context in terms of the demographic. And this part of the 3-day think tank lasted actually 6 hours. And everybody was really, really interested because, wouldn't you want to know what the demographics are like in the Gulf region? And wouldn't you want to know what Norway is struggling with right now? And anyway, so we spent a lot of time, and some of the information was really quite interesting. Canada, you all know. The U.S., I don't know if you knew, but by 2020, the largest ethnic group will be mixed race. Right now, 53.3% of the population is non-Caucasian. About 70% of the high-tech companies are either, the CEO is either Indian or Chinese, or one of the CEOs is either Indian or Chinese. Singapore, the lowest fertility rate in Asia. There's a national policy for multiculturalism. However, what that means and how this is going to be enacted is contested and not there yet. Gulf region I just talked about. And there's a parallel trend in Europe with low birth rates of established population. Increasing proportion of non-European born and second generation immigrants. For example, in Spain, 50% are foreign born in Madrid and Barcelona, the two largest cities there. Interesting. So the research question that we were looking at the beginning was, what is the nature of this new demographic? What are the antecedents? How does one become bicultural? Why do we want to know that if we're in a business school? Because we would want to be able to learn from the experience of becoming bicultural in order to inform the way we go about training our employees. So is there something, can we make a monocultural, can we help a monocultural learn the kinds of things that biculturals have learned just by accident of their life trajectory? So not to exclude the monoculturals, in other words. Can we think of a new typology beyond Barry's typology, about expatriate adjustment, for understanding multicultural identity in today's workforce? Are there differences between universal characteristics, skill sets, and country-specific skill sets? Do biculturals and individuals' multicultural identities have different skill sets than monocultural? That's obvious, but oftentimes you have to first answer the question as academics to show, to then contribute further. Cultural intelligence, what's the deal with cultural intelligence? Do certain biculturals or monoculturals have more or less of this, and why? So this isn't about saying, and what's difficult about this research is that it's really personal. So a lot of the people, whenever I talk about it, they say, well, would she count me in as a bicultural, or are you a bicultural because you're living in here? And everybody wants to be a bicultural after I give a talk like this. And they want to know which kind of bicultural is the best. It's not about this. I mean, what I'm more interested in is what is the experience, and how does one become bicultural? Not so much to say one's better, not at all to say one's better, but just to say we need to understand what people bring, how they got what it is that they bring, so that we can then inform our own practices of training and organization, but also so that we can acknowledge what people bring to the organization and better utilize them in terms of person, job fit, and those kinds of things. So cross-cultural adaptability skills, bridging skills, and what are the policy implications at the organizational and country level. So just a couple more things. Here's a bicultural Angli. He's had a very positive expression of his biculturalism. So he's been able to do very, very, very well-received films in his own countries, as well as not. So Brokeback Mountain and Sense and Sensibility have nothing to do with his country of origin, right? But he's able to have created expression in more than one cultural context. So the psychology of the dynamic multiculturalism is very important, because in some cases, biculturals are able to be very successful and contribute well to society, and in other contexts, they have a very negative experience. And so the psychologists in this think tank have brought up this issue where multiple cultural exposure, and here at the University of Victoria, I guess we think that multicultural exposure is very good, right? That we want our students to all have this. But the thing is, it's not always good. It's not just good. Just allowing people to have the experience is not just good, like we were talking at lunch. Then what happens after they've had this experience? And how do they negotiate entry back into a context in which they can be helpful to that context? And that's part of what our responsibility is as educators, to help people do that. So on the one hand, what multicultural exposure does is it gives you a multicultural mind, a global mindset type thing. Acquiring and representing multiple cultural knowledge and being able to sense multicultural knowledge, so that we don't, as companies, we don't enter into ruts. My favorite rut is that why Motorola lost its edge in cell phone technology? Well, it's because it didn't understand multicultural context. It didn't realize that huge parts of the world didn't have landline phones, you know, and so therefore it didn't even think about how quickly this could take off, a fire, wildfire. So this is the cool side, what the psychologists are calling the cool side, the good side. On the other hand, there are people like Frida Kahlo, who's a very well-known painter, who draws a self-portrait of herself at the borderline between Mexico and the United States, which is not a really rosy picture, is it? She doesn't look like a happy camper here. You know, very, very, very much pulled between her, not only her Mexican self, but her Mexican and her indigenous self in Mexico. And so the other side is that the multicultural self leads to a reacting to implications of the cultures that your self is made up of. And sometimes those are not positive. They might be negative. So there might be hot issues. And so the work, it's important to understand these two tensions. Here's another painter. I like art. So this is Pasita Abad, a Filipino artist. On racial, this is her portrait of racial identity crisis. So representing her Filipina dark-skinned side as well as the Spanish side that privileges the lighter skin. So anyway, the work that we're doing is really integrating and building on all the previous work that has been done in understanding biculturalism. And I don't want to go through this in detail here. If anybody wants to talk more about this, we can. But this is hopefully this article will be coming out in AMR. I'm writing it with a graduate student at ESSEC, Hei Jung Hong. But just kind of looking at how has multicultural identity been explored in different fields, sociology, psychology, and just a little bit in management around biculturalism of the African American experience. So in regards to hot processes, the difficulty of integrating these two sides in psychology, we, as part of this research group, we have Veronica Bennett Martinez, who's from Barcelona, Michael Morris, Irish American, and his colleagues at Columbia, Chi-Yin Cheng, who's in Singapore right now, Singapore Management University, and Fiona Lee at the University of Michigan, all working on understanding bicultural identity integration and doing a lot of laboratory experiments on understanding if someone has what they call an integrated bicultural identity versus a non-integrated bicultural identity, what is the differences in terms of what they can bring to an organizational setting. So they've done this one experiment which is really quite interesting. They have Chinese Americans, some with integrated bicultural Chinese Americans, and they give them a set of spices, Chinese set of spices and American set of spices. You probably didn't think Americans had spices, but it's like ketchup, you know, and stuff like that, and interesting things like this. And then they have them come up with new recipes using these spices. And what they found is the integrated biculturals had much more creativity in terms of coming up with new fusion foods. I have an alternative hypothesis, having been born and raised in Japan. I don't like fusion Japanese food. If I'm gonna have Japanese food, I want it to be Japanese food, you know. But I think I'm integrated. So sometimes lab experiments, you know, are you can think of alternative hypotheses to them. But they've done a lot of really interesting work in terms of understanding the differences between these bicultural types. And then Ying Hong, who is at, I think it's Singapore National University, and her husband, Chi-Yin Cheng, have done a lot on working with essentialism of race and ethnicity as associated with difficulty in switching between your cultural selves. And if you have difficulty in switching between cultural selves, you may not be able to provide a good bridge for people in terms of understanding different cultural contexts. How am I doing on time? We have until 1:30?
We'll have time for questions.
20 after, okay, so I want to give a lot of time for questions. So, cool processes, these are the processes that are useful to organizations, would be the work of Jean Chang, Fiona, Angela Long, Will Maddox, Adam Galenzi are looking at ways in which multicultural exposure enhances creativity. And so they've been able to show that it affects the way the brain processes information and leads to more creative outcomes. The facilitating factors of cool processes are having a learning mindset, a learning orientation, rather than a fixed mindset about what I should be like when I'm in a Chinese context, what I should be like in an American context. And openness to experience. So personality enters in, not just your cultural of origins. And the dampening factors are, interestingly enough, the higher your bicultural identity is, the less flexible you might be. And so the less ability you would have to transverse these processes and come up with something new that they're finding. And also, if you have racial or ethnic essentialism, that's kind of a rigidity that doesn't lead itself to being integrative across cultures. We've also been working with David Thomas's group at Simon Fraser University and his model of cultural intelligence, which combines cultural knowledge, cultural specific knowledge, with more cultural general skills repertoires, with a mediating framework of cultural metacognition. Cultural metacognition means, like Carlos Ghosn, being able to apply frameworks for understanding cultures, not culture-specific data, but saying, okay, I'm in Japan, this is kind of reminding me about the hierarchical, group-oriented nature of the Lebanese. And in Lebanon, I wouldn't go in and tell them what they do right away. I'd have to get their respect first and foremost. That kind of thing. So being able to apply certain frameworks to a whole other setting that you know nothing about, but you can intuit. Okay. I'm going to skip through some of the measures, if you don't mind, and get to the typology. So the idea is that hidden strengths, neither the biculturals or themselves know, can lead to skill sets that are incredibly valuable. This is a picture of me growing up on an island in the inland sea, and this is a picture of a Canadian and her daughter here in Vancouver. So what we've been doing is developing a new typology, and what we've done is we've used grounded theory triangulation with 312 narratives that myself and Hei Jung Hong have collected over the past 10 years, so a big data set. And a lot of this I was just doing serendipitously, and more recently, over the last 5 years, I've been doing it in a more kind of academic data collection fashion. Executives in the Silicon Valley, undergraduates, students in Silicon Valley and Vancouver, and then participants in executive ed at INSEAD. And looking at case studies of bicultural leaders in the literature as well. So where we are right now is we've identified 4 major types of ways in which people have experienced their biculturalism. And what we are finding, when I talk about the types, I don't want you to think of them as fixed, that you can have your formative years as one type, and then we mature, and we become other types of biculturals, or other ways in which we experience our multicultural identities. For example, I've gone through 3 of these in my lifetime. So one type is that of a one home, and I think we know many like this, that these are biculturals who identify more fully with one cultural culture of their origin. And so it could be a Korean American growing up in the Silicon Valley who's never been to Korea, doesn't speak Korean, but hears Korean at home and predominantly ate Korean food, but identifies more as an American, for example. The ethnic power or the back to their roots type generation. And fuse is interesting. It's like the Nuyorican, the New York Puerto Ricans, who have created their own culture. where the New Yorkers don't really understand them and Puerto Ricans don't really understand them, but together they're New Yorkers. Either ors are people who alternate between one or the other depending on the context that they're in. The neither nors are people who feel marginalized by both cultures. That they, like for example, my growing up in Japan, not looking Japanese. People have called me an egg, white on the outside, yellow on the inside. Even though Japanese was my first language, walking down the street, throughout my formative years, I was called a gaijin. Even though I didn't have a choice but to be living in that culture. And there are quite a few neither nors in all sorts of different contexts. Border town people can be like that. And then both and are bicultures who identify with both and feel accepted by both. And so the idea is that really the determinants are, in terms of being able to build theory, it seems like there's one side is your cultural self-identity, how you perceive yourself as one or the other, or more one or the other, for example. And so the one homes and the both hands are in the northern hemisphere of the grid, and these are people who feel both, And then the other dimension is if they feel accepted, if they perceive that they've been accepted by both of their cultures. Okay? And so the neither nors and either ors are ones that I'd say have more cultural angst, existential angst. Okay, and so these are just examples from the narratives, but at both ends says I'm Vietnamese and French, I know both cultures, and I like to think I am a premium blend of both. A one home, I'm Chinese American, but I don't speak any Chinese language, and I've only been to my mother's home in Kunshan once, and I felt like I was embarrassment to her mother's family. Neither nor, this is one of my favorite, I am a Korean Dane living in Sweden now. Growing up in Denmark, I never felt Danish, though I speak Danish fluently. I've never been to Korea, but I feel Korean. I've always been told I'm Korean. I mean, not hard to imagine when you're surrounded by blonde, tall Danes, you're told that. And either or, although I feel both German and Canadian, I feel more Canadian when I'm in Germany, and I am more German when I'm in Canada. Depends on where I am right now. So this is an either or who feels alienated in all contexts. What does this matter? So we've been testing this. What does this matter, and do they bring different things to organizations? Kind of the model, the antecedents, then inform the bicultural type, mediated by personality, individual difference in age, leads to different types of skill sets that are valuable to today's multinational organizations. So what we know thus far from pilot studies, and I can tell you more about how we've been doing this, but with the questionnaire, is that obviously biculturals have greater cultural metacognition than monoculturals. One interesting factor is we found that your bicultural type as you are now, as an adult, doesn't matter. It is what your bicultural type as a child was that matters in terms of what you bring to an organization. So even though I'm a both and now, what I bring in terms of my skill sets to an organization are that of being a neither nor growing up. And what we found is both ends. And what's interesting is this, is to be, there's something for everybody. You can say, okay, well, just because you're Korean American, you don't speak Korean, it doesn't mean you don't bring anything to the organization. Or the Korean Dane, the neither nor. What does the neither nor bring? It tested highest on the tolerance for uncertainty and highest on perceptual acuity. Little neither nors grow up paying attention to context. I've got to understand what's going on here so I don't embarrass myself or whatnot. So they're natural participant observers and bring that competence, which is very important to global teams. Either ors were highest on cultural metacognition and adaptability. One homes were most similar to monoculturals, but had the strongest personal autonomy. And so they would be able to bring a strong sense of values and represent the home organization. Next steps, we're finalizing and refining an online survey that we're going to launch in Schlumberger. And we want to continue to do qualitative research in ethnographic and narrative analysis to understand more about the subtypes and really to understand the path trajectory. For organizations, it's the benefits to organizations is that they can assess the non-technical aspects of their workforce capabilities, better matching a person job fit. There's a dissertation there, I think. Leveraging of multicultural skills for competitive advantage, like I was saying, being able to sense, meld, leverage knowledge, and modeling multicultural skill development and training in the development of global leaders. So there's a little bit of time and future research, but let me stop there and allow for questions.